Pilot/flight crews, what went wrong on your flight that the passengers never know about? I was flying a Piper Navajo that seats 8 passengers out of a small airport. We were making all our required radio calls, but because this was a small, uncontrolled airport, some people in small airplanes will operate without radios or just don't care enough to broadcast their position. Anyway, we were doing our due diligence, but not long after takeoff, and while leaving the traffic pattern, my FO says, "Crap!" and takes control from me and makes a relatively aggressive, for passengers at least, turn to the right. As he does this, I see a Cessna fly out of my left window no more than 150 feet below us. We essentially climbed through the altitude he was cruising at and turned to avoid him. Only one passenger noticed when we got to the destination, and he told us it was a good move. Story 2. Dad's a pilot, so I get to hear all these. Good one that comes to mind. Mind you, he flies 737s for a major airline. Getting ready to take off at night, he sees a plane about to land on the taxiway he's waiting on. He immediately just starts turning on every exterior light on the plane. Other planes pulled out of final descent at like 500 feet. Edit. Just talked to him on the phone about it. He said it was back when he was flying the 727, so about 15 years ago now. He remembers seeing the plane coming down, and the captain was looking back over his shoulder at another plane. So my dad starts throwing on all the lights, at which point the captain turns around, starts asking him what he's doing, and sees the plane, and then both of them literally just duck and wait for something to happen. And after a couple of seconds, when it's clear the plane wasn't going to hit, they both sit up, and my dad starts trying to call the tower. The tower is just not responding at all for a bit, and then a lady comes on, the dispatcher had been a man, and basically says, "When you get to your destination, call this number." And the dispatcher and the pilot of the other plane both lost their licenses. Story 3. I'm a bush pilot in Canada. I was working at the right seat of a turbo otter. My first ever flight in one, so I was still getting used to the setup. We were taking off from a short strip in the middle of nowhere with 6 drillers in the back and a bunch of gear. Captain started the engine as I was just finishing up the passenger briefing. He started rolling down the runway as I was just getting seated. I thought he was just positioning the plane to prepare for takeoff, but then he gave it full throttle. I didn't even have my seatbelt or headset on yet. I'm focusing on getting this stuff on when I realize something isn't right. Getting closer to the end of the strip, Captain starts to panic as we aren't getting airborne. His hands were shaking like mad and he kept reaching for things, but he couldn't figure out what was wrong. I think he was too busy looking at the trees and the creek right ahead of us. I realized the problem. He was in such a rush to leave that he didn't do a pre-takeoff check. Propeller was still in full course, feathered on shutdown. It would have been full fine for takeoff. I yelled/gestured to him the problem and immediately pushed the prop forward. Engine had a huge surge and we just barely cleared the trees at the end of the strip. He acted like nothing happened for the rest of the flight. We didn't even speak a single word to each other. I suspect none of the passengers even realized what had happened and how close we were to being another statistic. When we got back to the airport, I told him I was leaving, packed my bags, and never looked back. Yeah, like I understand brushing it off, playing it off for the passenger's sake, but the crew absolutely need to talk about that. How do you just act like nothing happened there? Story 4. I used to contract maintenance work on aircraft, and once a bunch of us were returning from a job in Germany. The plane was a scheduled flight on a small, 50-seat or so, turboprop aircraft, and it was a bumpy flight. I'm fairly well traveled, and working on aircraft made me more confident than most of flying, but the turbulence started to get so bad that I was getting nervous. Nobody except the flight crew were allowed to unfasten their seatbelts, and even they were being thrown about as they tried to move around. It was by far the worst flight I've been on. So anyway, just as things were getting to the peak of crappiness, one of the stewardesses made her way to one of my colleagues sitting across the aisle and said in a hushed tone, "Excuse me, sir, is it true that you guys are aircraft engineers? We have a slight problem out the back and thought you might be able to help." I honestly thought we were going to die, that the bumpiness was not down to turbulence, but some flight system had gone AWOL. I didn't know what the F any of us would be able to do on unfamiliar equipment with no documentation, no spares, and no tools, but sure enough, my colleague went off with the stewardess and disappeared through the door out of the cabin. 10 minutes later, he was back, and of course, we were keen to know what the problem was and if he was able to do anything about it. The problem turned out to be a ratchet strap on one of the cupboard doors in the galley was jammed, so they couldn't get the snacks out. The flight continued to be horrible, and the snacks were predictably crap. Story 5. Not me, but my father. Years ago, when Dad was flying the 767 for Air Canada, they were coming out of London, Heathrow, back to Canada, in the wintertime, and some snow had started to fall. Heathrow 10 years ago was notorious for letting a dusting of snow hamper operations. Dad and crew expedited boarding and pre-flight as much as they could and pulled the brakes and pushed back early to get ahead in the queue for takeoff. They couldn't get a taxi clearance right away, as a number of aircraft ahead of them had opted to, quote, wait for the heaviest of the snow to pass prior to taking off, and the controllers wouldn't move them out of the way. Dad basically begged them to move them ahead somehow, as he had been around the block a time or two and knew it was coming, but to no avail. Ground had them park the airplane, and they sat loaded at the gate for 4 hours before all flights out were canceled. Over 4 inches of snow. The airport's inability to deal with the snow and backlog of traffic meant that Air Canada couldn't get a plane out for 3 more days, by which time they had brought extra aircraft over from Montreal to try to relieve some of the buildup. So in this story, what the passengers didn't know is that if they were maybe 10 minutes faster boarding the plane, they wouldn't have gotten stuck in London for an extra 3 days. Story 6. We were flying from Dallas-Fort Worth to Honolulu. We were about 30 minutes past the point of no return, and the captain informs us, flight attendants, that we had to shut one engine down because it was overheating. We had about 2.5 hours before we could reach any kind of land. We had a new hire, 2 months, working the flight that got very emotional and started saying things like, "I don't want to die," in a panicked voice. We had to shush her so passengers wouldn't start freaking out. As time progressed, I tried to ignore the fact that the other engine could crap out, or we could have a third strike, or any number of things could go wrong. I started casually going through the cabin and rechecking all the emergency equipment on board. To calm the new hire down, I took her through with me to try and remind her of her training. Just as she started calming down, I noticed a strange noise coming from the functioning engine. It was the sound it makes when we're changing speeds around the time we're about to land. We were still 1 hour and 40 minutes out. The captain gives us another call and my heart sank. Just as he called, a passenger gets up out of his seat and collapses right in the aisle. His shirt caught on the armrest and ripped his shirt wide open. His wife screams. There are 4 flight attendants on this flight, so someone else answered the call from the captain, and I had to deal with this. In my mind, I'm thinking, how am I going to secure this guy if we're going down? Should I just leave him there and answer the phone? I need to know what the captain is saying. Meanwhile, the wife is trying to wake him up, and I'm asking my coworker to get medical equipment. I immediately switch to first responder mode once I see him turn pasty white. None of these passengers know about our engine problem, and only a few noticed this guy passed out in the aisle. I saw him fall, so I was the caretaker. The runner calls for any medical personnel on board and tells me that she can't call the captain because he's still talking to the lead. Oh, right, we have that going on too. By the time a paramedic comes, the guy is waking up, but says his chest is really tight. He's coughing and looks almost gray. We hook him up to oxygen and get him back to a seat. The paramedic says we need to land soon and get him to a hospital. As we get him back to a seat, I notice the lead flight attendant has a yellow life vest on and is coming towards me. Oh crap, oh crap, oh crap. She tells me that the captain was able to turn the engine back on and that we should be landing in about an hour. We send up the message about the sick passenger. I know most passengers had no idea about any of this. I was standing there in the back galley, sweating from helping this guy back to a seat, stressing about the poor new hire who we locked in the bathroom and just trying to gather myself. A passenger slowly walks up to me, stretching, yawning, pulls his earbuds out and asks, how much longer? Are you guys going to come out soon with the drink cart? Can I have a Sprite? All I could do was laugh at myself for getting so worked up. We landed with no incident. So this is why, for me personally, flying on a plane, I just put in my earbuds, put a face mask on if I'm just listening to a podcast or music, and just zone out, because that way you're just not privy to anything sketchy that's going on around the plane, and you don't want to know about that anyway because naturally you're just going to panic. So yeah, little pro tip there. Story 7. Fly to a major U.S. airline on a flight from Canada to one of the major NYC airports 2 winters ago. Air Mets for moderate rime ice from 15,000 feet to the surface from D.C. to Boston. However, destination was forecast 5 miles light rain/sleet, 3,000 overcast, so no alternate required. In the Part 121 airline, this kind of weather is not a big deal, just a normal winter day in the Northeast. As we descended into the weather, we get a master caution for bleed low temp. The air tapped off the engine for heating/anti-icing the wings is not enough. This sometimes happens at low power settings, so advance the thrust doesn't fix it. Instead, we get a new caution: stab anti-ice fail. The air temperature in the horizontal stabilizer leading edge is not hot enough to prevent ice from forming in the airfoil. As we start to pull the book and run the checklist for that message, we now get a master warning: ice condition, anti-ice and op. The aircraft has detected that we're in icing conditions and determined the anti-icing system is not capable of preventing ice from forming on the critical flight control surfaces of the jet. If not rectified, that last message is deadly serious, especially when flying in moderate rime ice. The left engine's bleed air was not enough. We pulled the book and ran the various checklists to address the cautions and warning for operating on single bleed in icing conditions. To make a technically detailed and complicated story short and understandable for the non-pilot, we executed the abnormal checklist procedures for the problems we were having, and the only solution that helped the situation was directing additional hot air from the right engine to the failed left side system. But this only created enough heat to stop the anti-ice failure. When so much hot air was used, it caused a master warning: bleed over temp. The risk of starting fire inside the aircraft's pneumatic system because the bleed air is too hot. We were now in a situation where we were in significant icing conditions, and the parts of the airplane that keep it in the sky, the wings and tail, were collecting dangerous amounts of ice and would begin to fail in a short period of time. Or we produce enough heat from one engine to do the job of two engines and risk a fire. But we could not do that and also descend without overspeeding the aircraft due to the high power setting required. The icing weather was covering the entire eastern seaboard, and because the destination weather did not require an alternate, we did not have the fuel to fly away from the ice. To make a long story short, according to the book, we were effed. The jet would begin to lose lift and fall from the sky, like the American crash in Roselawn, Indiana, or burn up in short order. Together, using our combined experience of 30 years flying this plane, the first officer and I created a procedure that combined two unrelated checklists, as well as some loopholes in the aircraft flight control computer logic to be able to descend through the ice without a fire or ice buildup and land normally, on time. There was no possible way anyone sitting in a passenger cabin would have had any idea whatsoever that any of this happened, or how potentially life-threatening it was. For the pilots wondering, the problem was the number one high-stage bleed failed closed. Story 8. So, in the military, we have a tradition called call signs. Everyone who's ever seen Top Gun knows what these are. Well, one of the pilots in my squadron while I was deployed to Afghanistan had the call sign Lucky. Now, Major Lucky was a really cool guy. Super chill, friendly, we'd hang out during the heat window and watch the jets take off and land. Had cigar Sundays where everyone who smoked would hang out and get their nicotine fix at the same time. Then Major Lucky told us how he got his call sign. He'd been an F-16 pilot back when he was a lieutenant and a captain. He changed over to something less dangerous after. One day, while on a training mission, his plane had been shot down over the coast of a near specific country, which I will not name to keep this more anonymous. He made a water landing and luckily had a flotation device with him. He floated in the ocean for 3 days before a German naval tanker found him. No one on deck spoke any English, so they couldn't return him to anyone until they came to port. By the time he got home, it was a week and a half later. The U.S. Air Force had found the remains of his plane, and because the cockpit was gone and there was no sign he'd gotten out, he had been presumed dead. They notified his wife and family and everything. So he had the pleasure of getting all that paperwork fixed and telling his grieving widow he wasn't actually dead. That's how he got the call sign Lucky. Story 9. I was asked this question by a passenger while I was experiencing a problem with the rudder/brake pedals in the plane I was flying. He basically asked what was the most urgent situation I had encountered while in flight. Little did he know, it was happening in real time at that moment. I had called the tower of my destination airport to report my position and request landing. As I'm going through my checklist, I position my feet on the rudder pedals to have authority of the toe brakes to slow the aircraft after landing. As one moved my foot on the right pedal, it sort of flopped forward. What does this mean? A couple potential problems, especially while on approach for landing. With the pedal flopped forward, it meant the top of the pedal would be pushed into the firewall and severely limit right rudder control. Not having bilateral brake control greatly increases the likelihood of a ground loop, or spinning out of control and flipping the plane over or off the runway. I narrated the problem to my passenger as I acted out the physical inspection to try and solve the problem. I reached down with my hand and flipped the pedal back up so that it was at least in the right position. Apparently, the linkage for the right brake had become disconnected. I knew that if I put the plane on the numbers, I had almost 5,000 feet to roll out and clear the runway for the next aircraft. I made an uneventful landing and just rolled and rolled with left, right, brake, and some counter steering to keep the plane under control while it naturally slowed. The controller asked me to expedite clearing the runway, and I replied that I would, but I still rolled until I could just steer naturally off the runway. The passenger had no idea that I was encountering my first significant mechanical failure. I was just over 100 hours of flight time and working at a flight school as a dispatcher and front office person on Sundays. My passenger was someone that one of our clients had dropped off at another airport and was unable to pick up. I told the guy I'd come get him after my shift if he'd cover half the rate of the plane of my choice. I was extremely familiar with the aircraft I chose, but a cotter key failed and allowed the brake linkage to disconnect. Everyone lived. Story 10. Girlfriend is a flight attendant, so I asked her for a few stories. One, upon landing, one of the tires blew out. It pretty much just resulted in a bigger jolt than usual, and although a few passengers commented on it, the crew just played it off as a more or less regular landing. Girlfriend says, "What are you gonna do? Tell everybody a tire just blew and get them all panicked?" 2. At least once a week, there's an armed, plainclothes federal air marshal riding on the plane, usually in first class. They're there as a security measure, in case the cockpit is breached or something. Even if people are aware that air marshals are a thing, usually portrayed in Hollywood as escorting a criminal, they don't realize the frequency with which the marshals ride along on planes. 3. A guy on the plane was from a connecting flight from a Eurasian airline, with a boarding pass under some other woman's name. The woman happened to be on the flight as well, so he obviously didn't belong. The guy could have stayed if he'd just gone through TSA again, but he refused to go through the process and was very strongly insistent on talking to the captain directly. Big red flag right there. No idea what the real story was. She believes that it was a foiled terrorism attempt, but the crew treated it as a simple duplicate boarding pass problem. Again, the problem was dealt with, and you don't want to unnecessarily worry the passengers. And 4, a lot of people try to join the Mile High Club. Like, a lot. So again, just completely agree with the notion of not worrying the passengers. It's completely beyond their control. There's nothing that they can do, so why wind them up and get them high-strung? Most of the time, outside of some turbulence, they're not even aware that something is going wrong. Story 11. Wife was flight crew for a major U.S. airline. They were flying Atlanta to Amsterdam. Their aircraft had just arrived from Mumbai, and it was, no exaggeration, infested/filled with mosquitoes. Don't ask how, because I don't know, but they were everywhere. Worse yet, the airline requires flight crew to take a drug called Malarone when flying to Mumbai due to the risk of contracting malaria. Since this was an Amsterdam flight, none of the flight crew was on the drug, despite the mosquitoes very possibly originating from Mumbai. They opened the doors to try and clear most of the insects before passengers boarded. They also called crew scheduling to try and get the flight canceled or the aircraft switched out. Their request was denied, and the flight carried on normally, with the flight crew being furious. Wife also contacted the CDC, who requested more information. Apparently, the airline intervened and advised she wasn't allowed to file a report. This was years ago, and wife never got sick despite her and several crew getting bitten. The odds of contracting anything are probably infinitesimally low, but still, it was the principle. Story 12. We were flying a west wind into a small airport in LA and had to shoot a NDP approach, which is basically flying along an AM radio beam. We had just purchased a handheld GPS, and the co-pilot was playing with it while I was flying the approach, and our cockpit instruments said I was exactly where I needed to be. The other pilot said the GPS must be a POS, or piece of crap, because it said we were a mile or more right off course. We double-checked our instruments, and they were dead on. Stupid GPS. We broke out below the clouds, and seems like about 600 feet AGL, and the airport is about a mile off to our left. Power up, go around, and a nearby military base talked us down with a radar, ASR approach. We got out of the airplane, and one of the passengers started talking to one of the people who met us about our adventure, and somehow it came out that the guys had been talking on the cell phones during our first approach. I went more ballistic than a corporate pilot should and gave him a lecture, and let him know that he put us in a place with antennas that were twice as tall as we were high, and that if we were in the mountains we would have been dead. Of course, he said he thought no cell phones was just a CYA thing for the airlines. We powered up the instruments and had him watch the needles while we made a call from where he was sitting, right below the antenna for the NDB, and the needles pulled 10 degrees or so when the phone was in use. Story 14. Not quite passengers, but I was in the Air Cadets when I was younger and got offered a gliding scholarship in the RAF powered glider. I was more or less ready to fly solo and was building up hours with the pilot in the seat next to me. Now, I was great at landing, but always a bit ropey taking off. I wasn't steep enough. This time I pulled up and I hear the pilot go, "Good, keep this heading." So we climb to the height we're looking for and I go to level out. The control column wouldn't move. I try again and it's definitely wedged. I've hit a slight nudge back and it continues to climb. At this point, the pilot goes, "We'll go on, level off then." So I told him it wouldn't level out, and his first reaction is to say, "Stop being a girl, it can't be stuck." I ended up telling him to take control of the throttle while I put 2 hands on the control stick and pushed all my weight behind it. I've never seen what I would consider a professional man look as helpless as he did for those few moments. Can't fault the guy though, as he ended up landing the thing with the trim wheel. The other guys on the scholarship were a bit miffed when it was pushed a further week as we had to ground all our gliders. Story 15. The passengers knew about it, but I don't think they knew how bad it really was. I was a crew chief on a S-92 heli, and we were evacuating some oil rigs from all non-essentials prior to a storm. It wasn't a hurricane, but they waited way too late to make the call. We ended up flying through some pretty rough weather all day, but it wasn't anything I hadn't experienced before. It was usually about a 3-hour round trip, so I always had a book to read and all the passengers usually took a nap. And because of my position in the aircraft, I can't see anything forward. My view is strictly 3 to 8 o'clock. The pilot told me one of the cells were closing in around us and we couldn't go around, and that it was going to get bumpy. I didn't think anything of it and continued reading. Normally, when we flew through clouds, it was still bright and, well, cloudy, like a thick fog. This time it got dark, like thunderstorm dark. It started off with just a few shudders and a couple big drops that would float you in your seat, and then we got hit with a wind shear. My head got slammed into the cabin wall, and then the aircraft pitched down and rolled left all at once as we pretty much fell from the sky. The co-pilot had controls when this happened, so he's yelling repeatedly over the comms, "She's trying to nose over!" Everyone that was asleep was now awake with a death grip on the seat in front of them, wide-eyed and staring at me. All I could think was, don't look at me, I'm freaking out too. We lost a good chunk of altitude, but we recovered and everything eased back into familiar territory. I'll never forget the violence and abuse that school bus with wings took that day. It took it like a champ, but I sure as hell didn't want to put it to the test ever again. Story 16. In PNG, as an aviation curious pax, flying out of Porgera Mine in Mount Hagen. We then used Mil-Me 8s for the bulk of transfers from the site to Hagen. Crew of 4, CFO, engineer, and a Lodi/radio operator. All Russian, never happy-looking campers at the best of times. I'm sitting 2 rows back from the front. They, pre-flight, get both turbines spooled up, and we lumber off and begin the usual brief fall down slope from the helipads. Always a fun part of the flight. Looking forwards into the cockpit, and the moment we begin to run downhill, the C and FO start jabbering at each other, loud enough to be heard over the din that a Mi-8 makes, and pointing repeatedly at something on the dash. Looks as though the FO wants to go back, the captain wants to go on, and they're not really that focused on what we're currently doing, which is a long swoop down the mountain, and while the trees are still a long way off, they're getting bigger real quickly. The engineer, sitting behind and between them, puts his hands on both their shoulders, leans right over the top of them, and smashes the offending area of the dash with a meaty fist. Apparently, this was the magic sauce. The engineer sits back, the 2 guys in front give a little cheer, give him a thumbs up, smiles, and ever so gently pulls us out of what had turned into to the eyes of a passenger anyways, pretty energetic dive-by at that point. I look around behind me, and there's a lot of wide eyes staring back at me. Face is frozen. Tense flight, that one. Story 17. I took a bunch of friends up at night to see the city lights. Unfortunately, the PCL, pilot-controlled lights, of my home airport, a tiny little airstrip really, but they did have runway lights, decided that that was the night they weren't going to work. The airstrip was in the middle of a decent-sized patch of woods and really only identifiable by the absence of light on a moonlight overcast night like that one, which made it totally impossible to find. Effectively, I was lost in midair. I know the airport's bearings from two VORs, radio navigation aids, so theoretically, if I went to the intersection of the two compass headings, I should be able to see my airport directly beneath me. But when I did, it was still so damn dark that the ground might as well have been invisible. I had plenty of gas, and there were 3 or 4 airports in the area that I could have gone to, but it would have been embarrassing as F to have to catch a cab back to where we'd left our car, so I crisscrossed the area a few times at low altitude with the landing lights on. To eliminate all glare, I turned off all the interior lights, leaving my passengers in the dark without explanation. Finally, I caught just the barest glimpse of the runway and took a mental picture of the setup. I flew an abbreviated landing pattern and lined up for final. The landing light showed me as being slightly off, so I slid left every so little and then set her down nice and easy. I turned to look at my friends. They were white as sheets. To them, it had been so completely dark that they didn't know whether we were 10 feet or 1,000 feet above the ground. They had no idea why I turned off all the lights and pulled power from the engine, and the bump of landing came as a total surprise. I laughed it off and said that I'd gotten lots of practice landing at airports with no lights back when I used to run drugs across the Mexican border. For the longest time, I think they actually believed me. Story 18. I used to work at LAX, and there was, I believe, a 757 that had come in from New York, and the pilots had written up one of the engines having more vibration than usual. Maintenance ran it and didn't find anything wrong with it, so they loaded it up for another flight. After takeoff, they noticed the vibration again. They didn't feel comfortable flying it, so they returned immediately. Maintenance ran it again, and as they were doing full takeoff power, the engine exploded. A turbine wheel let go and sent shrapnel all over the side of the plane. Half the turbine wheel went through the wing and fuel tanks, and the plane caught on fire. There were pieces of the engine all over the airport. I think it took weeks before they found one of the other turbine wheels that had crossed active runways. I don't think that plane would have survived the engine exploding in flight. It's a pretty big deal to return after takeoff. The pilots could have just said, "I don't want to deal with the hassle of paperwork," pissed passengers, angry management, etc., and continued the flight, but they made the right decision and saved the lives of hundreds of people. I tried to find a news story about it, and there is a tiny blurb in the local news and a quote from the airline saying something to the effect of, "There is an engine fire during a maintenance run, and we'll repair the plane and have it back in service." Yeah, right. They scrapped that burned out Hulk where it lay. Story 19. New private pilot here. Shortly after getting my pilot's license, I took some friends out flying in a Cessna 172, a 4-seater. I had trained on a much older and simple plane called Aeronca Champion, a post-World War II trainer. I had one previous flight with the Cessna, which was a 2-hour flight with an instructor, so I can get familiarized with the aircraft, and so the company that was renting it out can be sure that I'm a decent pilot. Anyway, after starting to take off, and right before reach the rotate speed, which is where you'd lift off, I moved my hand away from the throttle to double check that my flaps were up. Pilots are supposed to keep their hand on the throttle unless they need to move it for some reason. Little did I know that this aircraft had some sort of knob that increases and reduces the friction around the throttle lever, allowing the pilot to customize it so it's not too hard to move, but also has enough friction to stay in the location you leave it at, in my case, full power. Apparently, the pilot who flew the rental before me liked to have his throttle loose, I guess. When I moved my hand back on the throttle, I did not realize that it had come back about a half an inch. However, as we started taking off, I felt like the aircraft wasn't performing well, but I assumed that was because I was flying a fully loaded plane for the first time. We were almost at max gross weight. I continued climbing with the reduced power for probably 5 to 10 more seconds before checking the engine RPM and realizing that it seemed to be underperforming. I immediately pushed the throttle forward, and after reaching a safe altitude, I started diagnosing the issue and realized that the knob to adjust the friction even existed. Anyway, none of my friends noticed. Had we had a short runway and a tree line to clear after takeoff, this would have been a different story. They still don't know, but one of my friends that was on the flight knows my Reddit username, so we'll see if he ever reads this. Story 20. Many years ago, I was flying a medium-sized regional jet as a co-pilot. We were crossing the European Alps. The northern side had extremely crappy weather, with severe icing reported. Stuff you want to avoid with your plane. Southern side wasn't really any better, with at least slightly higher temperatures on the ground reported. To give some background, you want to prevent ice accumulation on your wing under any circumstances. Firstly, ice disrupts the airflow around your wing, decreasing the amount of lift created. Secondly, it increases your weight, which in turn requires you to have more lift. All transport airplanes have built-in ice systems for the wings. Most of them work with the use of hot bleed air supplied by the engines. So there we were, cruising in the crap weather, trying our best to find an at least decent route through the zones with the least icing. No chance to descend below the weather, terrain, or climb above it due to aircraft performance. Next thing that happened was a bleed leak. Basically, very hot bleed air was leaking out of one of the supply lines for our anti-ice systems. Since hot bleed air can do a lot of damage to other systems, we were required to switch it off immediately, and hence lost all of our anti-ice systems. We had around 20 minutes to the next airport while we could observe more and more ice accumulating on our wings. Wouldn't say I was scared, still a view that doesn't really give you a good feeling. In the end, we declared an emergency. Once clear of terrain, descended ASAP and waited at a lower and warmer altitude until some of the ice dispersed. Landing was flown at a higher than normal speed, but none of the passengers ever realized any of that. Story 21. Slightly OT, but the subject of what to, when to inform your passengers you have a technical issue is not an easy task. In my 10 years of flying, 5 with airlines, I've never experienced anything that I would describe as inherently dangerous. However, you do occasionally come across failures that, if mismanaged, could escalate into a potentially hazardous state. If your passengers have been told by gate staff that the flight is delayed because something is wrong with the engine, then, as the pilot, just saying nothing once they've boarded, walking past an engineer elbows deep in a jet engine isn't really an option. From experience, the best way to deal with these situations is to explain the delay was, for example, due to a faulty engine sensor rather than the engine itself. Whilst not always strictly due to this approach, is far more reassuring to the many passengers who already have a fundamental fear of flying. Something to think about the next time your pilot blames a sensor fault/erroneous indication for a technical delay. Story 22. Flying a Robinson R-44 helicopter in California on a romantic sunset tour. The tour was nearing a close. It was dark, and we were heading back to the airport when a red warning light illuminates, and my engine oil pressure drops to 0. The emergency procedure is to land immediately. Immediately means right the hell now. Not 2 minutes from now, but I'm over an area of dense almond tree farms and still about 3 miles from the airport. It's dark and there's no way of knowing what I'd be going down into. So I elect to continue to the airport, setting my aircraft up to enter an auto rotation, engine off landing, should I no longer have a choice. My passengers were a young couple celebrating their anniversary, and the woman noticed the bright red light in the darkness immediately, and of course asks, "What's that mean?" That's the, landing light. It means we'll be on the ground soon." We made it back. I shut down the aircraft and saw them out the gate to their cars and thanked them for coming out, and I ran back to my aircraft to find the skids and tail just covered in oil. The aircraft needed a complete engine replacement. Fake it till you make it, my friend. Way to play that off. You managed, you kept everyone safe. Good for you. Thank you for sharing that story, though. That was awesome. Story 23. Not a pilot, but I was on a flight that kept getting mysteriously delayed, but the staff would never explain why. They kept mentioning waiting on a part, and that there was a warning light, etc., but no one ever came. I was seated towards the back of this plane, and I heard the familiar sound of hydraulic pump cavitation, a really, really dangerous and common problem where air enters a hydraulic circuit that can easily damage components on said circuit. I was working in hydraulic engineering at the time and tried to explain to the flight attendant what I heard, and her response was simply, "Oh, yeah, the pilot thinks it's fine, no worries." They never mentioned anything, likely to not alarm anyone, but what bothered me is that no one from maintenance showed up. There were other concerned passengers that asked to get off the plane, stating that they did not feel comfortable, but the staff refused to let anyone leave. It was like a scene straight out of Louis C.K.'s stand-up. They just said F it and took off. I guess ultimately it was fine, but I just keep imagining landing gears or wing flaps malfunctioning. Story 24. Years ago, I was in naval aviation, and my squadron boarded a C-9 out of Reno. The Navy pilot said we were overweight, but it should be fine. We start rolling down the runway. At some point, you expect to pivot up, but no. We kept rolling, and everyone, all aircraft mechanics, started looking at each other. By the time we started to actually freak out, and keep in mind that we were used to working a flight deck, which is dangerous day or night, the plane barely tilts up. If we cleared the perimeter fence of the airport by more than 5 feet, I'd be amazed. But wait, there's more. So, heading back to Norfolk, we're on approach to an Air Force base in Oklahoma, and we hit a wind shear that was the mother of all wind shears, and even the aircrew had a WTF look on their face. We land, refuel, had a much longer runway, and take off with no issue. Home free, right? Big effing wrong on that one. We're on approach to NAS Norfolk at 10 p.m., and it's foggy like pea soup. We go around for a second attempt, and as we're pulling up from second attempt, we see runway lights disappear as we climb. We've been flying for 5 to 6 hours on an overloaded plane, and a C9 is good for 6.5 hours normally, from what we were told by aircrew. So we're all nervous, cabin is really quiet. We make jokes that the pilots couldn't hack the fleet, but we knew. So pilot says we're diverting to Oceana, which is 10 minutes away. Clock's ticking, fuel's burning, we're sweating, and approach is just as foggy. We're diverted to Norfolk International, and again, approach is foggy. Now everyone in the squadron has become a devout priest, and prayers are heard throughout the cabin. Aircrew is strapped in, and on approach to Norfolk International, we again see runway lights as we climb. So pilot comes on, cool as a cucumber, and says we're going to NAS Norfolk as it cleared up some. An entire squadron was about to become FOD on some runway. Anywho, we coming in, it's still foggy as hell. I'm sitting just forward or the port wing next to the window. I see the runway approaching and about to let a sigh of relief out, and an entire ire situation worth of emergency vehicles line the runway as we slam down hard, like no grace at all from the pilot. As soon as we feel the reverse from the engines kick in, everyone cheers like the world was just saved, because our world was. We all knew something was majorly effed up. While leaving the aircraft, I asked one of the enlisted aircrew what the issue was, because fire trucks don't line a runway for anything but an emergency. They said the hydraulic primary was out and the secondary was not in good shape either. In other words, no hydraulics, no controlled flight. It was the flight from hell. Story 25. Army Black Hawk crew chief. In our Iraq trip, we were climbing out of Baghdad International Airport after a patient transfer. The controllers were Iraqis being trained by USAF personnel, I believe. It was a relief to hear an American going in because the Iraqis were pretty hard to understand. Our controller had us take off on a heading that had us going straight for a descending C-130. My pilots put the aircraft on its side, then righted it again. Asked as casually as I could, "What was that?" Just as casually came the answer, "Oh, C-130. Oh." Guatemala was fun. We flew into San Marcos, which is a small strip up at about 8,000 feet. Because the strip is in the middle of town, there are 2 to 3 clear paths where the locals just cross the strip instead of walking all the way around. We typically did 2 low approaches to let everyone know we were coming in so they could clear out. One day, we spooked a mule carrying a load of firewood, which scattered across the walkway next to the airfield. "Lo siento, señora." Another day going in there, we had our stabilizer, the elevator on the tail, kick out of the automatic mode. Since we were on approach in, we manually controlled it for the landing and continued down. An actuator had failed. Passengers had no idea, so apparently we did all right. Not a flying story per se, but in Afghanistan, my crew was milling around on the porch, about to head to dinner, when we heard a C-130 spooling up for takeoff on the other end of the field. FOB Fenty at Jalalabad was, a base built around a runway, very cramped. We all paused our conversations and plugged our ears for the noisy takeoff. As soon as the Herc rotated, their countermeasures system unloaded. Chaff and flare firing off everywhere. The flares were bouncing between our Blackhawks and the 10th cab approaches farther down the taxiway. They were bright enough to burn memory in your eyes for a minute. 334 got hit in the landing gear, and 595 took a hit to the tail dive shaft covers. It scorched the paint. We spent the next hour picking up little squares of aluminum off the ramp so it wouldn't FOD out our engines. Thanks, USAF. Thanks. You don't hear about blue-on-blue attacks in the media. Always trust your guts. Do a walk around. Story 26. I was flying my stepdaughter back to her mother's, a city about 80 miles away, in a Cessna 172. It was semi-stormy, but I really wanted to fly, and being young, a very inexperienced pilot, less than 80 hours at the time, and pretty foolish, we went anyway. My girlfriend came along too. We got about 30 miles into the flight and ran into a cloud bank in the mountains. I'm thinking, we can fly through this to clearness. I'm sure it's only a little bit away. So we fly into the cloud and into zero visibility. My first time in zero viz. As a pilot, all the experienced pilots here know what happened in the following minutes, and they're rolling their eyes and shaking their collective heads. We're cruising along, and I'm hoping to see some clearing out ahead soon. I casually check the instruments because that's what one should do when one is flying blind, and I notice we're in a steep climb and losing speed rapidly. In my mind, I'm thinking, holy crap, but I try to remain calm and get the airplane back into level flight again. While doing this, I'm thinking to myself, wow, you really can't tell by the feel what altitude your plane is in when you're in a zero visibility situation. I decide it just might be a good idea to turn around and get out of this mess before something really bad happens. I put the plane into a gentle level turn to head back the way we came. I'm keeping an eye out for obstacles like mountain sides and trees. About halfway through the turn, I check the instruments again. Holy crap! I have one wing pointed to the ground and I'm losing altitude at a prodigious rate. I level the plane back out, again, and fly with my eyes pretty much glued to the instruments to keep the plane flying the way I think it's flying, with the occasional brief check for mountainsides and such. We finally exit the cloud, and I tell the girls we should probably head back because I don't think we can safely get to our destination given the current weather conditions. They were completely clueless the whole time of the danger I had stupidly put us in. Many unforgettable lessons were learned that day. Story 27. A thread I have a good answer to. Happened earlier this year. I work as a pilot in the US, was coming into Denver, and we were getting to just about the end of the arrival procedure, which puts us into a position close to the airport so air traffic control can vector us onto an approach to a runway. We were in the clouds and the temps were below zero. We started to pick up icing, which is no big deal normally. All commercial airliners have de-icing equipment that's able to keep planes ice-free as long as it's not severe icing. We're continuing down the arrival when we receive a bleed leak. This means that somewhere in the ducting, hot air from the compression section of the engine, about 700 degrees Celsius, is escaping somehow and entering into one of a few places, all of which should not have that much heat being applied to it. The logic in the pneumatic system automatically shuts off the bleed that's affected at the engine, so no more bleed can enter the system. The pack on the affected side, which is used for pressuring the plane and controlling the temperature, encloses the crossbleed, which connects System 1 to System 2. Because the crossbleed is closed and the number 1 engine bleed is closed, we've now lost de-icing to half the airplane while in moderate icing. This is a huge deal, as ice that resembles sandpaper can reduce large amounts of lift on a plane. We immediately declared an emergency and turned towards Denver. ATC gave us the closest runway, and I flew while the other pilot ran a checklist and started running a QRH. Fire trucks were rolled and were put into position, and we came in as fast as we could. We taxied into the gate, and when deplaning, a few packs asked us about the fire trucks because we had zero time to even think about explaining the situation to the people in the back. Story 28. Was on a flight from Milwaukee to Denver on Midwest Express back in the day. After takeoff, there was a very loud bump. I fly a lot, and this was not a noise I had ever heard. No announcement. The flight attendants are acting normal, so not sure what's going on. But the wind noise in the cabin is much louder than normal while cruising, and the plane is shaking quite a bit. No idea why. So we start coming in for a landing in Denver, and we notice a line of yellow emergency vehicles with flashing lights driving on the runway. We land and immediately taxi to where the emergency vehicles are going. When we get near them and stop the emergency vehicles around us, after about 20 minutes the emergency vehicles leave and they taxi us to the gate. Only at this point do they tell us that one set of landing gear didn't stow properly after takeoff, and thus we flew the whole way with one set of wheels down. And they weren't sure that set of gear was fully locked for the landing in Denver, so had the emergency vehicles out just in case we had issues. Made for an interesting flight, and those fresh-baked chocolate chip cookies they served were awesome as usual. Story 29. My dad travels a ton for his job, so he's extremely comfortable on planes and has a very good sense for how they typically operate. On one flight several years back, there was a sudden jolt that he could tell immediately was not related to turbulence or something like that. He said that whenever something like that happens, he watches the flight attendants really carefully to judge how bad it is. Well, after the jolt, one or two of them went up to the front of the plane. He said the look on their face when they came back was enough for him to know that it must be pretty serious. I think he said the pilot came on the PA and said they needed to return to the airport they departed from. Or maybe they just flew on? I can't remember. But when they landed, he hung back till he was one of the last ones on the plane and caught the pilots as they were leaving. He told the pilots, "I fly a lot and I've not felt that kind of jolt before. What was that all about?" Well, after some I need to know back and forth, they said that something in the vertical stabilizer locked up or seized or something, so they were unable to steer. They didn't go into much detail, but he said he looked it up later and realized how close of a call it was. Story 30. Descending through 10,000 feet from Cincinnati to Fort Myers, the autopilot kicked off, re-engaged, and it kicked off immediately again. When I took the controls, the elevator was completely frozen. The elevator is the appropriately named control that controls going up and down. Kind of important. Clear, calm day in Fort Myers, and we flew a long approach controlling the aircraft with trim. Hard to explain, but basically very slow, small, and delayed inputs to pitch like the elevator. Nice landing, nobody ever knew, and the company immediately asked us to fly back to Cincinnati. Obviously, we declined, what with the inability to control up and down movement of the aircraft, and went to the hotel. Airplane sat in Fort Myers for 4 weeks, and they never found any problem, except ice around the elevator cables. We probably should have declared an emergency and had people brace for landing, but it worked out. Definitely not as hard to land an aircraft using trim in real life as it is in the sim. Even to the point we didn't panic until we got to the gate and realized what we did. Story 31. I'm a glider pilot, and I had taken a buddy up for a flight. Keep in mind that we had a strong headwind for takeoff, 30 kts. So after some fun time in the air, we approach 1,000 feet above ground, and it's time to get in the circuit and prep for landing. I enter downwind and start my checklist, and before I know it, I'm already past the runway and ready to turn on base. Being that the wind was so strong, we had barely lost any altitude by the time we reached base, and I was still around 750 feet AGL, instead of the usual 500. That point I went, I'm gonna overshoot the runway. Side note, in a glider, overshooting the runway means that the ground crew has to run effing far on the runway to get you off since you can't move. Back to the story. I decide to angle out on base to give myself more time to lose altitude, and I turn for final at around 150 AGL. Problem is, now I'm effing far from the runway and I have a headwind of 30 kts to fight against. At that point, my heart started pumping, and your natural instinct is to pull nose up and sacrifice speed for altitude, but in a glider, speed is a must, especially if you have headwind. So you don't really want to be stalling right above ground. So I push down on the stick, increasing speed to cut through the wind. Finally, we make it to the runway, and we cleared the tree line by about 6 feet and landed safely. Story 32. 2004/2005 at KALB, I was flight training for my PPA-SEL. I showed up on a normal Saturday to head up for the last few flights before my check ride. I head out onto the ramp and notice a heavy police presence, but I think nothing of it as crap happens from time to time. I'm doing my pre-flight and an Albany police officer is just sort of doing circles in the vicinity, watching everything while some black Tahoe SUV sat idle maybe 500 feet from me. I start going around the empennage and I see a private jet doing a bit of a high-speed taxi. He turns and parks 2 spots away from me. These SUVs flew like a bat out of hell up to the jet, and as I looked up, I saw Bill and then New York State Senator Hillary Clinton step out into her car. By far the coolest thing I've ever seen up close. My flight instructor comes out maybe 20 minutes later and I tell him what happened. He just laughed and went, yeah, right. I've also happened upon you too and a few other senators that way. So what my instructor never knew is how effing cool it was for 18/19-year-old me, and he thought I had mistaken her and Bill for someone else. If she hadn't been with Sick Willie, I could understand, but he's a effing legend of a former president. You can't miss Bill. Story 33. While stationed in Washington, I fulfilled a years-long promise to the retired parents of my childhood best friend. I think they've always considered me a second, more successful son, since they lived a couple hours north of me. I had promised to take them for a ride. Anyway, I arranged to meet them at the Blaine Airport, which is pretty much scrunched up against the Canadian border. I make it there just fine in my rented Piper Cherokee. After doing weight and balance, I figure I'm only comfortable taking one at a time. So the mom gets in and I take off. Winds are calm. The sole runway is clear to the north, but Canada is right there. No way to take off without busting through their airspace. To the south is the typical line of fir trees. Like an idiot, and with only a cursory glance at the departure plates, I'm taking off to the south. I mean, it must be okay, since I shouldn't be going in Canadian airspace. I'm feeling cocky, impressing the crap out of the mom, who as a little kid I crushed on for years. The trees are getting closer, and I'm not getting as much altitude with the extra packs. I start getting this vague concern. I shouldn't be hoping to clear these treetops. I clear the tops, and I'll always have the image in my mind of the tips of them sliding underneath the wings. Probably cleared them by a good 50 feet or so, but it felt much closer. I act like everything is fine and dandy and do my thing. I land, help her out, and quickly break out the departure plate, where it clearly says takeoffs are to the north into Canadian airspace. How did I not see that? Next takeoff was to the north, because the winds had shifted. Yeah. Story 34. Not a passenger pilot story, but still pretty eye-opening. One of my buddies is a former German Air Force pilot who now flies professionally for an outfit here in the States. He flies alone and without passengers. That's all I can say to keep him anonymous. I was making a joke about him having a beer at work and that, quote, it's not like he could get pulled over in the air. He says that due to the altitude, he'd be pretty hammered off just one beer, so he would strongly advise against it. He acted jovial about it for a sec, but then got real serious. He said that back when he was still with the German Air Force, he did a training mission with other NATO countries. A bunch of pilots from country, keeping it anonymous, got stumbling drunk before a flight. In the morning. A few other countries had sent pilots up in the air. He was waiting in a hangar to run out to his plane, and he thought, maybe these guys have sobered up or someone had said something. He saw a group of the country guys walk out to their fighter planes. They all started to climb in. One guy had to be helped into his plane, and another was climbing into his cockpit backwards. After a bit, the pilots from the country took off, and he said he looked at his fellow pilots and said, looks like Germany's not flying today. He promptly called his superiors and told them why. He also flew a little too close to Area 51 while on a training mission here in the States. A buddy in the U.S. Air Force radioed him and told him he was too close. They all promptly turned around and flew back to base. Yeah, I wonder what the recourse is for flying too close to Area 51. Like, do they just immediately gun you down out of the sky? Like, there's gotta be, like, top air security for that, right? Story 35. Well, the passengers knew about this one. Was flying a small charter unpressurized PA-31 over the Rocky Mountains, and had to briefly pop up over 12,000 feet in order to satisfy GASA, area safe altitude. Upon reaching altitude, there is a loud bang followed by fluffy styrofoam type stuff floating around in the cabin. My ESCS, emergency sphincter clamping system, triggered immediately, and I started looking for the cause, guessing at first that we just had a collision with something. After about 5 seconds, I hear a trickle of laughter coming from the back, and I turned around to tell the PAX to cut it out while I figure out our life and death problem. It was at that moment the fault became crystal clear. PAX had brought on a huge sealed bag of that curly popped artificial popcorn stuff, and said bag had ruptured due to the low pressure at altitude. There was a curly puff all over the rear seating area and being blown around by the HVAC. Took me 2 hours to vacuum it out of the aircraft after we landed, and even then I would get a curly puff flying out of a vent on occasion for the next 6 flights. My kids love that stuff, but I refuse to buy it now. Story 36. I'm a private pilot. Flight training and first flights afterwards were in a 30-year-old beat-up Cessna 172. The fuel and oil gauges worked, but barely. Needles would kind of float up and down when turning, climbing, or descending. During takeoffs, I like to take quick glances at the oil temp gauge to see how the oil is doing. If it shoots up quickly, you can abort the takeoff. On one of my early flights with passengers, instead of doing its floating thing, the oil gauge just kept creeping upwards slowly, but not fast enough to warrant an abort. I took off, but instead of following my original plan straight out of departure, I slowly and carefully turned to enter the traffic pattern and set myself up for a landing as I kept watching the oil gauge. It kept creeping up slowly, but the engine was still acting normally, so I didn't want to alarm anyone. You know, low-time pilot and all. I just set myself up for a tight base leg and quick landing without saying anything to the passengers. No tower, so just recording required an announcement on the common frequency radio about entering the pattern. As I approached the turn to the base leg, the oil gauge had started dropping, so I simply skipped the turn and continued out. The rest of the flight was uneventful, and I never told the passengers. No passengers, but another time during training, I failed to raise the flaps after a touch and go, landing in immediate takeoff, often used during practices. This would ordinarily be very bad, as you wouldn't have enough lift to get a good climb rate with 30 degrees of flaps, but fortunately it was a coolish summer day, denser air, and I was flying solo, less weight, so I was able to clear the trees and then get the flaps back up. Checklists would, of course, have caught the flaps up, but there's basically no time to do a checklist during a solo touch and go. After that, I never did a solo touch and go. It took more time, money, and gas to do a full stop landing, taxi back, and take off, but being relaxed and doing the checklist is worth it. Story 37. Flew into Miami one summer, passenger, to work in Florida for a few months. Was getting into Miami around late evening and skies were clearish, so thought the landing in 20 minutes was going to be okay. Pilot told us we were landing at a different airport though due to weather building. There was intermittent fog and clouds forming, low, and when we came into the landing, we were coming in hot and the pilot overshot it, so we basically touched and flew back up. Clinched a-hole, white knuckles at this point. Meanwhile, that weather system is getting more dense, dusk turning to night, and a new airport strip has to happen. What the F? Are we running out of fuel at this point? Visibility is opaque at best. Can we even land? Landed half an hour later in a complete blind landing. Could barely see the runway out the window. Not sure if this is an occasional scenario for some pilots, but now I know how stressed a human can be when things don't go smoothly 10,000 feet up.